BH2.
Tonight on Talking Politics, what if you could work 4 days a week instead of 5 and maybe even make the same amount of money? As the reimagining of work-life balance prompted by the pandemic continues to play out, the 4-day work week is now getting a closer look on Beacon Hill. We'll dig into the idea in a few minutes. But first, a new coalition of left-leaning groups called Just Majority is pushing to expand the U.S. Supreme Court. And this week, they kicked off a national tour right here in Boston with help from some of the biggest names in Massachusetts politics.
Our goal to the Supreme Court is simple. Get your house in order, or Congress will do it for you.
We are building a nationwide movement to ensure there is a majority on the Supreme Court that stands up for equal justice. I don't want to mess with the Supreme Court, but the Supreme Court is messing with our democracy.
The court is meant to ensure equal justice under the law, but in its current configuration, the highest court repeatedly overturns the will of the majority of the people. And they behave as if the rules don't apply to them.
But even if you accept that diagnosis, and an increasing number of Americans do, is expanding the court really the best solution? For that matter, how likely is it that public pressure will push lawmakers or the court itself to change the status quo? Joining me to discuss are Renee Landers, a professor of law at Suffolk University, past president of the Boston Bar Association, and a former deputy assistant attorney general in the Clinton administration. I'm also joined by Paul Collins, a professor of legal studies and political science at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. Thank you both for being here. Renee, this group, Just Majority, mentions recent decisions as something that they find extremely troubling when it comes to the court, but they also highlight recent revelations about Justice Clarence Thomas. He has, as you know, and many of our viewers will know, apparently been the beneficiary of largesse from Harlan Crow, a conservative mega donor for a couple decades, and has not disclosed that fact on financial disclosures. And he also didn't recuse himself from cases involving the 2020 election, even as his wife Ginny was actively working to overturn the results of the election. How troubling do you find Justice Thomas's conduct in these two cases?
So I think Justice Thomas is kind of the canary in the coal mine on this entire issue of the ethics of the Supreme Court. The real problem is that the Supreme Court is not bound by any rules of ethics that would regulate their disclosures, regulate their recusal requirements, and also provide a mechanism for the public to have insight into how they make these decisions about recusal. So I think the real problem is, yes, these are all very troubling revelations about him, but I'm sure you could find something on several of the justices, failure to report or, taking money from someone that doesn't seem quite right. But I do think that that the real problem is that they need to adhere, adopt an ethics code, or I think the Congress will do it for them.
Paul, do you agree with Renee's assessment when it comes to what Justice Thomas did or did not do? Is the big problem at this points up the fact that there's not a rigorous ethics code for the court?
I completely agree. So part of the issue with the Supreme Court, as Professor Landers said, is that the court doesn't have an ethics code. I'm a little bit concerned about what Congress will have to do in order to get the court to have an ethics code. This is to say that it's not evident to me that Congress could pass an ethics code and say, okay, here it is, you have to follow this. I think Congress essentially has to get the court to do it. And to do that, they probably have to play some hardball. The court seems very reluctant to adopt an ethics code on its own.
What would playing hardball look like if they cannot, in fact, pass an ethics code for the court? How might they push the court to take that step?
I think Congress, its big power is its power of the purse. Congress sets the court's budget. Now, Congress has to pay Supreme Court justices. That's in the Constitution. But Congress can use some creative ways to constrain the court through the budgetary process. For example, not funding the court the way it's currently being funded. I think that's Congress's big mechanism.
I want to talk about the decisions that the court has issued recently, which have been pretty prominent, because that's another piece of this push that just majority has launched and bigger public backlash to the court. But before we get into those decisions, I want to look at some data that Pew has put together when it comes to how Americans feel about the court, how they felt about the court over the last 3.5 decades. First off, the favorable numbers for the court have dropped really sharply since the mid to late 80s. Back then, 76% of Americans had a favorable assessment of the court's performance. Now it's down to 49%. And there's a big partisan drop that is fueling that, and that's the way Democrats feel about the court. You look back in the, again, mid to late 80s, about the same number of Republicans, even more Republicans than Democrats, thought highly of the court, 80% for Republicans, 75% for Democrats. Now it's down to just 28% of Democrats who feel like the court is doing its job well. Renee Landers, one point that Ayanna Pressley brought up is the idea that the court's recent decisions are out of step with where the American public stands on issues like abortion rights, gun control, civil rights, other things. Is she correct in that assessment?
Well, I think she is correct, but I hesitate to make that the total metric of the acceptability of court decisions, because if you look back to the 1950s and 60s, the court's decisions in Brown versus Board of Education, Loving versus Virginia, which is the case saying that laws against interracial marriage were unconstitutional, those cases were very unpopular also at the time that they were decided. So I don't think that's the total measure, but what is wrong with the recent decisions of the case, the Brune case on the Second Amendment and the Dobbs decision on the constitutionality of access to abortion, is that those decisions really changed long-standing ways of looking at those constitutional provisions. And they're actually, first of all, in the abortion case, they're disrupting Roe was a compromise, and it was working okay, and they're disrupting that balance. And then in the case of the Second Amendment, and also the abortion cases, they're using this history and traditions test to look at the validity of current regulatory laws, and that's inherently reactionary and backward-looking, and that's really what the problem is. It's not the decisions themselves.
Just inside, I want to make sure that I understand the Brune ruling, the gun control ruling correctly. What the court says, tell me if I've got this right, is that when regulations are passed involving guns, gun ownership, the focus needs to be, as you said, on tradition, whether those regulations comport with tradition, historically speaking, as opposed to any public health benefits.
Correct,
right?
Correct. And in fact, in the majority opinion in Justice Thomas's decision in that case, they kind of openly mocked the dissenters for referencing the statistics on gun violence and all that sort of thing that perhaps were motivating some of the restrictions. And I think that's very problematic if you're not looking at what the impact of the legal rule is on society today.
Paul Collins, given the problems that we've been talking about here when it comes to the court's decisions, lack of disclosure, lack of recusal, public opinion, to the extent that that is important, do you think that expanding the court would be productive if, in fact, there was some mechanism for expanding it? Or do you think that the advocates who are pushing that are barking up the wrong tree?
I appreciate where the advocates are coming from. It's an interesting way to address the current issues facing the Supreme Court. I personally don't think it's a very wise move. I think what it would beget is a tit-for-tat strategy. That if you increase the size of the Supreme Court today to add 4 justices, it becomes a 7-6 liberal to conservative court. The next time around, what's going to happen is it's going to be increased again. So I think that there needs to be other solutions that are seriously talked about in terms of how to address the problems facing the Supreme Court.
What might some of those solutions be, to your mind?
I think that the best solution that would help address, although it would take a while, the current problems facing the Supreme Court would be to institute 18-year term limits. This would provide a variety of benefits. One thing it would do is kind of take the heat off the Supreme Court appointment and confirmation process. Today, it seems like every time a seat opens up on the Supreme Court, the sky has fallen. We get into these bitter partisan battles. If you had staggered 18-year terms, a president would get a selection every 2 years. It would also serve the function of connecting justices closer to the American public, which would address some of the concerns with these wildly out of step rulings involving issues like gun rights and abortion rights.
Renee, how do you feel about the idea of court expansion?
I kind of agree with Professor Collins, because I think that yeah, it will result in this tit-for-tat kind of situation. Another solution, in addition to the 18-year terms, that's been proposed would be, to get rid of this idea of, the Supreme Court justices being, their own kind of thing and status, and perhaps considering having a rotating panels, randomly selected perhaps, but some mechanism of selection of a Court of Appeals judges who would serve a few years on the Supreme Court and then go back to being appeals court judges. So again, trying to take all the, a lot of the political heat and valence out of the Supreme Court selection process.
As we talk about these prospective reforms, I'd love to get each of your takes on whether public advocacy of the sort that we saw on display in Boston this week, whether that is in any way helpful when it comes to pushing these reforms. Paul, let's start with you, and then we'll go to Renee. Does that help the case, make the case for reform, to have people calling out the court publicly in the way they're doing right now?
I like the idea of talking about the Supreme Court in this way in a public forum. Frankly, I think the Supreme Court has kind of become such an elite institution that we need to take it down a peg. We elevate judges in this country, and this is particularly true with respect to the Supreme Court. And so, for example, if you take the proposal of having the Supreme Court be a rotating panel of courts of appeals judges, that's a really interesting proposition, because it would take some of the elitism out of the Supreme Court. One of the things that doesn't sit right with me, and it's really at the heart of a lot of what we're talking about with the Supreme Court, is this idea that the Supreme Court is above everything else. It's above a code of conduct, for example. This is very problematic, and I think it would be a healthier discussion to take the court down a peg, to talk about them, about what they fundamentally are, which are civil servants, and to have this discussion in public, I do think is useful.
Renee, do you agree with Paul?
I totally agree, and I think it was really profoundly disappointing to see Chief Justice Roberts' response to the request that he appear before the Senate Judiciary Committee. I think that it was completely tone deaf to the political mood in a lot of the country that is not really impressed with some of the actions of the court recently. And I think that it does smack of this elitism, that they somehow, we should trust their judgment about these ethical rules. Every state Supreme Court in the United States is bound by a code of judicial conduct that they adhere to, and in fact, there is a disciplinary process that applies to all of them. They do not operate with that level of arrogance about their role in the judicial system.
I want to make sure I'm remembering this correctly and refreshing the memories of any viewers who might need a refresher, as I do. Justice Roberts said that it would raise separation of powers concerns, right, if he were to go before Congress? Or am I getting that wrong?
No, that's what he said, and I totally disagree with that. I think it'd be one thing if Congress were asking him to come and justify the decisions of the court. That would be wrong, and that would intrude on the judicial role. But asking him to come and testify about applications of ethical rules, just like the budget, as Professor Collins referred to, is not problematic, and I don't think it raises any separation of powers concerns whatsoever.
I want to ask a closing philosophical question of each of you. Paul, you can go first, and then we'll hear from you, Renee. But part of the criticism that this group, Just Majority, is making is that the court is now too powerful and too political. I'm wondering if there was ever a time when that was not the case, or if, in fact, we've just had our eyes opened to that inherent politicalness and power in a way that we haven't before. So, Paul, what's your take on that?
The current Supreme Court is probably the most ideological Supreme Court in American history. So the court has always been a partisan institution. It was effectively designed to be a partisan institution in terms of the way we pick Supreme Court justices. But what's happened, and this is very recent, is that we can basically sort Supreme Court justices by their partisanship. And because of this, it looks overly partisan. In terms of power, it is making radically fast decisions. So we're used to seeing changes made in the judiciary occur over the course of decades. And what we're seeing today are these very, very swift, very, very significant changes, again, in areas like abortion and gun rights, that it's almost impossible to attribute to anything but a change in the makeup of the composition of the court itself.
I think that gets to the point that you made earlier, right? That there's a disruptiveness, structural disruptiveness to the decisions the court is making right now?
Yes, I agree with that. And, you know, just going back to your question historically, you know, the country started out the iconic Supreme Court decision, Marbury versus Madison, about where the Supreme Court, you know, gave itself this power of judicial review, operated out of a controversy over appointments of judges. So this has been going on since the beginning of the Republic. So that sort of aspect of things is not new, but I do agree with Professor Collins that the rapid fluctuations in doctrine is really what has caused the concern right now.
All right, Renee, Landers, Paul, Collins, thank you both for this. Appreciate it. Next up, is it time to say goodbye to the 5-day, 40-hour work week? I don't know about you, but by the time Thursday comes and goes, I am more than ready for the weekend and perhaps on occasion a tad less efficient than I was a few days earlier. A number of studies and pilot programs have explored the issue and found widespread success for employees and their employers. And now a group of some state lawmakers are pushing for something similar here in Massachusetts. One bill would establish a pilot program with qualifying employers to study the impacts of a 4-day 32-hour work week. Another would take a very different approach to make 4-day work weeks the norm. The legislator behind that second bill, Representative Erica Eiderhoven of Somerville, joins me now along with Juliet Shore. She's an economist and sociology professor at Boston College, and she serves on the board of the nonprofit 4-Day Week Global. She was also the lead researcher on the organization's global pilot program. Thank you both for being here. Erica, let's start with you. What would your legislation do on this front?
Yeah, so my legislation is pretty straightforward. It would ensure that we have 32-hour work weeks, and that would be considered the normal work week in the state of Massachusetts.
How would it ensure that?
It's the same as how we have, 8-hour days, 40-hour work weeks. So that's, essentially put into law like that is the norm. Similarly, the United Arab Emirates did something with their, similar thing with their workforce in the government. Of course, it wasn't mandated by corporations, but they eventually just followed because it became the norm as well.
And tell me if I've got this right. Your bill, were it to become law, would require that over 32 hours a week, people are paid time and a half.
Overtime, right? That's correct. Yeah, that's absolutely. So.
Your colleagues, Josh Cutler and Dylan Fernandez, as you know, we're taking a different approach. As I mentioned a moment ago, they're incentivizing, or they're proposing a program that would incentivize employers to experiment with this. The employers would get a tax break for doing so. Is that approach, that second approach, more politically palatable, perhaps, not just to House leadership, but also to the business community, which I would imagine might bristle at some of these proposed changes?
Sure, yeah. I think they're both great proposals, and like with anything, right, we always love to study them and understand them and do more trials. And, although we have had many trials done across the country, having one specifically in Massachusetts, I think is also just a great idea as well. But I think it's also important that we keep driving the narrative that really, this whole idea of a 40-hour work week isn't just, didn't descend from nowhere or set in stone, right? This is something that actually was first changed in New England to have that go from 6 days to 5 days, and really just draws to question, right? Like, why do we have a 5-day work week or 40 hours a week work week? That there's no real reason for that, right? That has just kind of just been the norm that we've had for a while. And I think, if anything, I think my proposal is a very modest one because, we had actually, back in the 60s and prior to that, the Senate subcommittees said, because of increase in productivity, they expected that we were going to be working only 15 hours a week in the future. And when you think about how much we've had so much technological advancement, increase in productivity, and yet one job isn't still enough, right? And yet people aren't being paid a living wage. And so there's drawing to question much bigger issues around, what should work look like, and how do we take advantage of all of these increases in technological advancements?
Juliet Shore, in addition to everything that I mentioned before, you gave a TED Talk last year, which has a whole bunch of views online, called The Case for the 4-Day Work Week. Can you, forgive me, I omitted the subtitle, Benefits for Employees, Employers, and Society as a Whole. Can we start with employees and employers? And can you talk us through, in the trials that have been done, what is gained by those two groups when a 4-day work week is implemented?
Sure. So we're on our 7th trial now. We have, probably 6,000 employees around the world, many in the U.S. and Canada, and What we found is that across all the measures of well-being, there are big increases for employees, whether we're talking about reduced stress and burnout, better mental and physical health, more life and job and time satisfaction, less anxiety and fatigue, better exercising, better sleep, and so forth. So those are all really well documented and very, very consistent across industries, kinds of people, countries, et cetera. I think what people would be most surprised about is how much the companies are thriving as well. So almost all of the companies that have gone through our trials are continuing with the 4-day week. There are just a handful, really, that have decided, often because they get an ownership change, not to continue it. They're reporting that productivity is either staying the same or going up because they go through a process of sort of rethinking what they're doing before they start to make it possible for people to be as productive in 4 days as they are in 5. Performance is better, revenue is up. So it's really happy campers on both sides.
I think we have a graphic that drives home some of what you've talked about in terms of the benefits to employers and employees as well. First off, from the pilot program that you put together, let's look at revenue changes for employers that have participated. During the 4-day week trial, revenue I have went up 8%, and then compared to the prior year went up 38%. Can you just talk me through those numbers so I get those correct, or we understand those correctly?
Yeah, so those are from the first 2 trials, which are US, Canada, Ireland, and one big global company. 8% increases over the course of the trial. We were a little bit, so from beginning of trial to end, we're a little bit concerned about seasonality in some of these businesses because it's just a 6-month trial. So we said, okay, let's compare to the 6 months in the previous year, same 6 months. I don't think that 35% roughly figure is really mostly due to the 4-day week. A lot of it has to do with coming out of COVID.
That makes sense.
21 to 22. But the 8% during the trial shows that while they are doing this, their revenue is really robust.
I want to roll one more set of numbers and then get back to you, Erica. This is, I believe, from your first 2 trials as well. And it involves the benefit to employees. The employees at companies that participated, 67% reported feeling less burnout. And I believe employee fatigue levels improved by 9%. That burnout number is really striking to me.
Yes, because we have a stressed out and burned out workforce in the United States right now. It's part of why we have unfilled positions and Great Resignation. It's by no means the only thing that's going on, but it's also one of the reasons that employers are starting to look at this innovation and say, you know, maybe I should do this, both because they care about employee well-being, but in many cases also they need to keep their employees from quitting because they're burned out.
Erica, I'm wondering if your bill were to become law, is there a risk that some employers would say, well, okay, we have to pay time and a half when we go over 32 hours. So we'll just pay what we used to pay at 32 hours. People will take a 20% cut in hours worked and a 20% cut in wages. So if it were to happen that way, then employees would just end up paying a price for this extra day?
Yeah, and I think that's where I think the bigger question around here is around, right, like one job not being enough. The fact that, you know, people still have to work multiple jobs to be able to, you know, pay their bills in Massachusetts. And so to me also, I think it is important to talk about this as not just when people say 4-day work week, they think, oh, it's the knowledge economy, maybe tech, right? We've heard of law firms, but really we've actually seen the same benefits with, again, the same amount of productivity, or if not better, for frontline workers, for nurses, for, you know, garbage collectors, with outcomes that were actually, you know, more positive, like, for example, with, you know, patient outcomes and you know, seeing the impact there. So it really does come down to where do we put our priorities and how do we ensure that we can have that kind of transition so that we have outcomes that are positive for all.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because I do think of this and other changes to work, one of which I'm going to ask Juliet about in a moment, as very much the province of white-collar work. Right. So I'm glad that you pointed that out. Juliet, we have been in the midst of this great big rethinking of at least the way white-collar work currently works, and maybe the way work in general should work. Right now, I come into the WGBH studios maybe 2 or 3 days a week instead of 5 days a week. I really appreciate that flexibility. I feel like it's made my life better in a number of ways. I'm glad that we're permitting it moving forward. But I'm wondering if you think that the changes that we've seen over the past couple of years lend even more momentum to the push for a 4-day work week, or conversely, if they maybe sap that momentum, since we've already changed so much that we used to take for granted.
I think that they have increased the momentum. I mean, the 4-day week's been around for a while. Pre-pandemic, it was sort of, a small number of companies implementing it and maybe evangelizing about it, but really very, very few. The pandemic really changed a lot. And what we're hearing from employers is that the shift to remote work kind of opened their eyes to the possibilities of other kinds of changes. As one CEO, actually the first one in our trials, the first company in our trials told me, he said, work from home taught us that we could trust our employees about where they work, and we can also trust them about how much time they spend at work. And so I think it's given, a lot of momentum to the 4-day week movement.
Erica, I think you're going to get the last word here. Where do things stand right now with the legislation that you filed and that your colleagues have filed?
I mean, it's just the beginning of session, so we are still having these discussions. But I think, like Professor Shore said, right, this has been a really serious issue and a conversation we've had because of coming out of the global pandemic. It's really defined what it means to work and what does productive mean and how we can utilize our time more efficiently. And I will add just one piece that, as a legislator, oftentimes we don't come in on Fridays. We work kind of almost a 4-day work week, so I find it to be a helpful conversation to have, especially amongst us.
That's a good point. You tend to be in the district, I think, is the term of art on Fridays. All right, Erica Eiderhoven, Juliet Shore, thank you both. That's it for tonight, but do come back next week. And please tell us what you think. The email's talkingpolitics@wgbh.org. The website is gbhnews.org/talkingpolitics. Or you can find me on Twitter. I'm at Riley Adam. For now, thank you for watching, and good night.
Basic Black is